When it comes to the Nintendo 64, there are many games on the console which are forever ingrained into your childhood memories. Games such as Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Diddy Kong Racing and many more, which as soon as you hear the name will bring a flood of amazing memories back to you, playing with friends, huddled around your N64 console, or just kicking back and playing on your own. There are however many games on the console which are so strongly associated with the Nintendo 64 that many people have either forgot or never knew actually had multi-platform games. And so for today's video I dug through the Nintendo 64 library to pick out a selection of games which many of us will only ever remember being on N64, but they're actually available on other consoles from that era and sometimes with better results. As always, if you want an actual review of any of today's games then head on down to the description box and I'll hook you up. For today's topic of conversation in the comments section, I'd love to know of any games from any console and generation that you thought were a console exclusive, only to then find out, maybe even years later, that it actually was available on another platform. Did that encourage you to try out the other console version, or did you stick to your guns and just play the game that you knew and loved? When you hear the name Snowboard kids, if you don't get a swash of amazing memories, I really feel for you. The game was an absolute cracker of an experience, and it was a sleeper hit in the early years of the Nintendo 64's lifespan. Many critics dubbed the game as Mario Kart on snow, and perhaps that's a great way to describe it. It sold so well here in the PAL region that it was the first non-Nintendo game to get a Player's Choice release, which dropped the price and helped it reach an even larger following. Whenever you'd mention the game in school, everyone would always discuss playing it on their beloved N64, and I've harped on so many times over the years about how much of a multiplayer classic it was in my family household that I'm going to save you the same story today. But wait a second, it wasn't a Nintendo 64 exclusive? Rakdim, who developed the title, saw how well it did on the Nintendo 64 throughout 97 and 98 that they decided to add a few more bells and whistles and release Snowboard Kids Plus in Japan in 1999. This version of the game added animated cutscenes and higher quality audio, which the CD it was shipped on allowed them to do. Not only that, but it expanded on the game's storyline and added a ton of new characters into the mix, with the ability to customise them in the board shop with new outfits and hairstyles. Perhaps the biggest change, however, is the worst decision the game made. Part of the fun of the Nintendo 64 version was that at the end of every lap you'd have a scenario where you'd all be scrambling to jostle your way to the front of the queue for the lift back up to the top of the mountain. The PlayStation version puts you in autopilot mode as soon as you cross that line, and so all those moments of memorable pile-ups from your N64 memories are a thing of the past in this version. The game's resolution is also lower than that of the Nintendo 64, and so everything does look worse in my opinion, and of course you have loading times to boot. Now just don't get me started on the Nintendo DS Snowboard Kids or we're going to be here all bloody night. Wetrix is up next, and yet again it's another example of a game being moved from the N64 to another platform and given the Plus edition to its title. This time however the game was moved from the N64 to the Sega Dreamcast of all places with the release of Wetrix Plus. This game was a foundation for early puzzle game fans on N64 and also a game which would always be lurking in those dusty bargain bin boxes, as it was one of the cheaper games to be released, often costing only around 40% of what most shops were asking for Turok Dinosaur Hunter. The game on Dreamcast follows that of the PC version for the most part with upgraded graphics, but the soundtrack was also in line with that of the PC, and so any fans of the classic N64 basslines will sadly hear them missing. Like the actual game itself, this is just a short explanation because the game is designed to be played in short bursts, and although it's a fun game it doesn't quite have that same addicting quality as say something like Tetris. It's also damn hard from the moment you start playing, and so I don't want to embarrass myself with any more gameplay footage, so I'm going to move on. It's time to get your rat out as we try and snatch those rats with our cats, some of whom are wearing hats. Rat Attack is an obscure game even by Nintendo 64 standards, but it's one of those games that's so obscure that you think it's because they just pumped it out quickly on N64 and then wept as it failed to bring in the revenue. The game, however, is actually a fairly interesting puzzle game which sees you pick a cat and you're tasked with capturing enough rats in an area using your net type thing and then trapping them in a Ghostbusters style vaporizer machine. Rent a Kill would absolutely love this game, but most people, they only get a few hours of fun before the novelty really starts wearing off. Despite even myself thinking that it was an N64 exclusive for many years, there was also a version on the Sony PlayStation that actually came out a year before this one. The PlayStation version was actually included in one of those official demo discs that would often help sales figures alight for some of these smaller games. But even after a positive review on the PlayStation, the Nintendo 64 version just seemed to get lost in a wash of other great games which came out around the same time as it. Glover has got to be an N64 exclusive, right? Like a French person wearing a beret, the Nintendo 64 and Glover go together so perfectly. Any dodgy game store you went in during the N64 era, you'd see cutout displays for the game, and when you combined it with salesmen trying to tell you that this game was better than Mario 64, it helped propel this unique platform game into some quite impressive sales figures. Whenever you'd see screenshots of this in magazines, it looked fantastic, and the bright colours really made the game stand out, especially when you learn of the game's unusual glove and ball mechanic. Hand in glove, the sun shines out of our behinds. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a Smiths reference out of nowhere that 99% of you will have no idea what I'm going on about. But back to the game. Whilst the N64 press and the publisher Hasbro Interactive seemed to really get behind Glover and almost turn him into a third-party mascot for the N64, the ultimate betrayal happened the following year when the game was quickly rushed out onto the PS1. So rushed in fact was it that IGN even stopped in to give it a 2.6 out of 10 rating. And as a whole, the PlayStation press rightly pounced on the fact that it was quickly rushed out port and that it had clearly been done for commercial reasons rather than wanting to put a good version of the game on the platform. Now, about that Glover 2 we sat waiting years for. I'm picking San Francisco Rush 2049 here to show you, but you could pick any of the 3 games on the N64, and of all of them, well, they were actually multi-platform games. So why does everyone only remember the N64 games? Well, I don't have the answer, but my expectation is again media related. When the game was first released on Nintendo 64, it was during a period where the console was in a bit of a drought period. I remember the droughts of being a day one adopter for both the Nintendo 3DS and the PlayStation Vita consoles, and they were tough, but the Nintendo 64 drought felt even longer. So armed with very little to report on, the gaming press seemingly squeezed every bit of content out of the game, covering web pages and more importantly magazine pages with guides, secrets, walkthroughs and anything they could think of to help fill a few pages using San Francisco Rush. The result of that was that you'd see the game absolutely everywhere, and eventually your curiosity would cave in and you picked it up. The PlayStation version didn't arrive until 1998, which meant that the game had a whole year to grow its audience on N64. When most people realised it was actually an okay game, they naturally got Rush 2 when that was released, and also late in the N64's lifespan we also got Rush 2049. All of the games were multi-platform on its release, but for many it's only ever going to feel and be an N64 game forever fused into our subconsciousness. Goldeneye for a long time was the weapon of choice for N64 fanboys when it came to fending off attacks from PlayStation 1 owners about which console was superior. So when EA got their grubby mitts on the Bond license, we knew that we wouldn't be seeing the last of Bond on N64. Years later, EA published Twine, developed by Eurocom on the N64. Now, the Nintendo 64 didn't get Tomorrow Never Dies, and so whenever I think of The World Is Not Enough, I instantly think of the awesome N64 first-person shooter that we all secretly know was fantastic, but don't want to tarnish our lovely memories of Goldeneye with. The game looks great, sounds amazing, and has an arsenal of weapons and gadgets to die for, as well as some great visual options with the expansion pack, and some clever level design to boot. The game, however, was only an N64 exclusive for a matter of weeks, as the PlayStation 1 version of the game came out shortly after, albeit it was developed by a different developer. So why does everyone remember the N64 version of the game and forget the PS1 version? Well, probably it's because the N64 version was good, and the PS1 game wasn't. Sometimes the answer is just obvious, people. The N64 game also managed the impossible, and that it was released a month earlier than planned because the studio managed to wrap up the final build earlier than expected. Imagine hearing something like that in this day and age. Speaking of impossible, how about Mission Impossible? Forever hyped by Nintendo 64 journalists as being the console's big answer to Metal Gear Solid, Mission Impossible went through development hell before the final build of the game was sent out in a rough state to prevent the studio hemorrhaging any more money on the project, which seemed to never end. As the game was delayed so many times, it continued to be fed to journalists by the studio bit by bit, most likely as a peace offering to try and keep them on board, whilst behind the scenes it was utter chaos. With the game out on store shelves and some money starting to be recuperated, German developer Example Architectures was tasked with porting the N64 version over to the PS1 with a quick build of the game to cash in on the far larger gamer base the PS1 had amassed at that point. With nearly $3 million to help promote the PS1 version and some great improvements over the N64 game, it's perhaps the best way to play the game, but it still failed to deliver on pretty much everything that was promised when the game was first announced all those years ago. It's a clear example of a studio with fantastic ideas, but without the skills to be able to implement it correctly. Roadsters is a game which is a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. It is rough around the edges and with some signs of greatness, but ultimately all you've got to know is that it was developed by Titus. Yes, that Titus. The N64 version actually reviewed okay in magazines, all things considering, and although I'll never replace many of the console's fantastic racing games, I still enjoy a good whip around this game's tracks every so often. It landed on Nintendo 64 in 1999, but in the year 2000 ports were rolled out from Smart Dog on the PlayStation and Player One on the Dreamcast. Those versions were met with much more hostility than the N64 version ever was, but I think it's because they knew that it was a quick cash grab, and seeing the Dreamcast version is like watching that fantastic console get a dagger stuck in its side. It's not pretty, and the Dreamcast of all consoles didn't need this N64 shovelware clogging up its library. And wrapping things up for today with perhaps the most obvious PS1 to N64 port looking game of all time is Polaris Snowcross. Developed by Vicarious Visions and published by Vatical Entertainment, this multi-platform release was a game which, if you just take one look at it, it screams blocky polygons of the PS1, and yet somehow it never clicked with me until years later that it was a port of a PS1 game. Perhaps I was distracted by the box art, which proudly proclaims that the game is the first snowmobiling game on the N64 to be released. The PS1 version got mixed reviews, the N64 version even worse, and even now it's an obscure title which I don't mind dabbling with every now and again, but I'd much rather be out in real snow than looking at these square flakes this game presents. And so there's my roundup, it's over to you. Were there any games I've shown you today that you could have sworn were only available on N64? You'd have thought that with me having both the PS1 and N64 at the same time, that I may have cottoned on to a few of these being multi-platform releases, but perhaps it was the N64 tinted goggles that stopped me from being able to read all of those hand-scribbled labels on the PS1 discs, if you know what I mean. As always though, thanks for watching, and until next time.